This is audio 4 of week 7, part 2. We're looking now at slide 14. So, escalation began as the Americans decided that there was no other way to win the war in Southeast Asia except to fight it themselves. There had been advisors only, to Vietnamese forces up until 1964. In 1964, an incident was manufactured in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is the body of water lying off the coast of North Vietnam. The U.S. government claimed that fast boats, PT boats, from North Vietnam had attacked an American ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. A ridiculous idea, but there it was. And this was used as a pretext to land troops in large number in South Vietnam to protect American interests there. The escalation over the following 3 years was intense. Before long, there were 550,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. They would go there for 1 year at a time, and then they would rotate out. They would rotate in and out of a unit. In other words, the 1st Cavalry Division was permanently based in Vietnam, and people would be assigned there for 1 year, and then they would go on to another unit a year later. This was true of all the units that were permanently based in Vietnam. And this led to what you might call a short-timers attitude. I don't want to get too much into this sort of stuff because it's really more U.S. history now than Asian history. But it impacts what we're speaking about because it meant that there wasn't much commitment on the part of the U.S. troops who rotated through Vietnam other than to make sure they survived and get the heck out. It was not the sort of war that was fought in Korea, even in Korea, and certainly was not the sort of war that was fought during World War II, where entire units would go in and out, and the Americans learned from that and started rotating entire units in and out during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which of course worked out so much better. Never mind. A major event that occurred during this time was an offensive by the North Vietnamese in February of 1968. This is Lunar New Year, known here as Chinese New Year. It's also Vietnamese New Year because the lunar calendar is traditionally used in Vietnam just as it is traditionally used in China. And February is normally when New Year falls. So there was an offensive. It was a surprise offensive. It was very well carried out. However, the immense firepower that the Americans were able to bring against it defeated this offensive. However, just as happened with Dien Bien Phu, it was not the firepower or the military reality of the situation that was most important. What was most important was that up until that time, U.S. generals were telling everyone, and the U.S. government was telling everyone, that the U.S. was winning the war in Vietnam. And to prove it, there would be enormous body counts every week that would show how many people were being killed in the greater cause. And then came the Tet Offensive, where there was an actual assault by an armed unit against the American embassy in Saigon, as well as lots of other astounding feats. So even though the communists lost that battle on the battlefield, they certainly won it on the cover of the New York Times. And the result of that was a tremendous flagging of enthusiasm about the war. And to make a long story short, Richard Nixon was elected in November of 1968 as a peace candidate. He proved to be anything but that once he took office, but that's why he won the election. And he began a policy which was called Vietnamization, the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam and their replacement by competently trained South Vietnamese units. That's the way it was supposed to be. In reality, of course, it was not quite so simple. When the Americans realized this was not going to work, they agreed to peace talks that were held in Paris over about 3 years. These peace talks were difficult. They eventually achieved an agreement on a ceasefire, which you see depicted here on a New York Times front page spread. But it wasn't very long before there was complete collapse of the Saigon regime, and the U.S. ended up bringing out the last of its people in helicopters to aircraft carriers. Let's go on to slide 15. At the same time that this was going on, there was the struggle in Cambodia. At first, this struggle was one of the national leader, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, to keep his country out of Vietnam, that is, out of the Indochina War. He was a very clever politician. He was mercurial, that is, he would change like the weather. He would be calm one minute and angry the next. He would be friendly toward one side one year and unfriendly the next. He had no tolerance at all for political disagreement with his own position. It didn't matter whether it was elite disagreement or popular disagreement. He ran his own secret police. There was torture. There were disappearances. All those things. Rigged elections were certainly a specialty of the Sihanouk regime. I don't want to get into too many details about him because books have been written about him. He was quite a man. And one interesting point about him is his unfathomable ability, his unbelievable ability to engender love and respect amongst the population, which was based partly on traditional values and partly on supporting the monarchy, and partly on his ability to keep the Buddhist clergy on his side. He was less popular in the cities, but especially amongst educated people who didn't like what he was doing with the suppression of political opposition and of rigged elections and so on. His neighbors didn't like what he was doing, and because they wanted him on their side, not on somebody else's side, or like his own. There were coup attempts against him that failed. But he did a very good job of keeping peace in Cambodia. His main goal was to avoid being invaded. Let's go on to slide 16. While he was doing this, the Indochinese Communist Party was busy. They formed a Cambodian branch, and their principal leader became a man called Salith Sar, whose revolutionary name was Pol Pot. Salith Sar was studying to be a radio technician in Paris in 1950 and 51. He did not fare well in school. While he was there, he joined the French Communist Party and was referred to the Indochinese Communist Party. He returned to Cambodia as a failed student, but immediately received assignments by the ICP, and eventually, after retreating to the jungle, he became one of the leaders on the Central Committee and the Politburo of the party, and in 1968, he became the sole leader. Part of the reason for this was his talent for organization and propaganda, and part of the reason for this was that he was an extraordinarily ruthless man. In 1970, the intense U.S. bombing of the Cambodian countryside began, and in the 2 years between 1969 and 1971, the Cambodian Communist Party grew. I forget what the figure is, but there was tremendous growth. And the reason for this tremendous growth was the anger and the bitterness that arose from the U.S. bombing of the countryside near the Vietnamese border and further in. Why was this bombing going on? It was going on because the Vietnamese had moved into that part of Cambodia and were conducting operations in South Vietnam from there. And when these bombings took place, they were from B-52s flying at 20,000 feet. Therefore, they were not exactly precise. This, of course, was in the time before smart bombs and all those other nice things that keep the arms race going. And so, as a result, the countryside was radicalized. And Salazar was very clever at taking advantage of this. He turned the propaganda focus toward blaming the violence of the bombing on the parasitic city dwellers, who were all Lon Nol traitors, as he put it. Lon Nol, if we'll go on to the next slide, 17, was the general the U.S. put into power after Sihanouk was deposed. Actually, he was the general that the U.S. asked to depose Sihanouk. Unfortunately, he was an ineffectual leader, as leaders go. He was not able to keep the army organized. He was not able to solidify civilian support for his regime in the cities. And his military was not able to stand up to the Vietnamese. Mostly they retreated, the Vietnamese communists who were occupying parts of his country. And that's why the U.S. initiated the bombing campaign to begin with. But it would not have been fair to expect the Lon Nol regime to solve any of these problems. The Cambodian military was kept purposely small by Prince Sihanouk because he was relying, for the most part, on his own political abilities to keep Cambodia neutral. And he was successful as long as that went. Now, had he stayed in power, it's anybody's guess whether he could have kept the country neutral. From the reading I've done and from talking to people, I don't think that would have happened because the power of the Vietnam War in 1969 into 1970 was so immense. The determination of the two sides to win the war was so strong that keeping Cambodia out of the war was probably impossible, whether Sihanouk stayed in power or not. Let's go on to slide 18. I hope you watched the movie about Cambodia that can be streamed through D2L, The Killing Fields, because rare amongst movies like this. This is not a love story about two Westerners who meet under unusual circumstances and discover how much they have in common as the world collapses around them. This is a story of Cambodia. Partly, it's a story of the relationship between Sidney Schanberg, the New York Times reporter, and Dith Pran, who was his chief fixer and translator from where he worked in Phnom Penh. But that's really only a sliver of the story. The story is really about the hell that Cambodia went through during the Khmer Rouge regime. Khmer Rouge was sort of an insulting phrase that came from the pen and the lips of Prince Sihanouk. It just means red Khmer in French. The ideas that the Khmer Rouge had, that Pol Pot had, came largely from the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, as well as the unique and positive experience of development of the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, namely running big gulags where people would be sent to be killed or kept out of the way. And when I say that, what I'm talking about is the idea from Joseph Stalin that you can cleanse society simply by killing or exiling people you disagree with. It's an idea. Stalin was not the first one that had that idea. Anyway, the Khmer Rouge followed an extremely brutal policy of evacuating the cities and then killing off people whom they considered to be enemies that would never come to the side of Ankar, of the organization. At least 200,000 people were purposely killed, and another 1.8 million died of overwork and malnutrition. Saloth Sar, Pol Pot, I hate to keep saying this about people. You know, I said Stalin was nuts, and I said Mao was probably losing his mind. Saloth Sar was clearly insane. He decided that that the key to prosperity, besides ridding Cambodia of all the people he didn't like, was to recover parts of Greater Cambodia that were under the control of the Vietnamese, under the control of a military power many times the strength of his own, a population 10 times, maybe 15 times larger than his own. He would take back those old parts of Greater Cambodia by sending raiding parties into them and killing all the Vietnamese. He started by killing all the ethnic Vietnamese who lived in villages on the Cambodian side, which didn't make the Vietnamese government very happy. But then he moved further and did these cross-border raids. This didn't last very long. It lasted for about a year. The Vietnamese tried to have negotiations with him and stop him from continuing to do this, but that didn't work. The Vietnamese invaded in January of 1979. And if we go on to slide 19, the Chinese invaded Vietnam to teach them a lesson. That was Deng Xiaoping's idea. We'll teach them a lesson. But that didn't work very well either. The Vietnamese threw the Chinese back with substantial casualties. The Chinese discovered that they really did not have the ability to invade another country. This led to the Chinese making a decision to cut back and reorganize their armed forces so that the next time they had to fight a war, they could actually do it. Now you see this interesting illustration on the top, this cartoon. This was the American idea that we were discussing a while ago about what happens if you don't oppose communist dictatorship they'll take over countries one by one that will just fall because they are ready to topple. They're so vulnerable, so fragile, that they can be overthrown at the snap of a finger. However, there were no further successful communist revolutions after 1975, and adherence to socialist principles went straight downhill. They lasted for a while. They lasted for about a decade and a half, but starting in the late 1980s and into the 90s, they pretty much went the way of the buffalo. There are still communist parties in charge in Vietnam and Laos. There's something slightly different in Cambodia, but things have completely changed, as we'll discuss in the next couple of weeks. Vietnam is now a de facto U.S. ally, and the only dominoes of interest to anybody in Southeast Asia are Domino's pizza outlets, which now are everywhere in Asia. Well, yeah, who won that war? I'm not sure. Let's go on to the last slide. And here, I just want to, I'm not going to read through all this stuff, but I want to point out that there have been an unusual and complex basket of changes that have occurred in Southeast Asia. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because a lot of the stuff that I list here, the material wealth going up and income disparity remaining skewed, technological advances and environmental problems, we're getting into the 1980s and 1990s now, but we will talk about those in future weeks. The new and the old have become cheek by jowl in Southeast Asia, and we will examine more about how that happened and what are the results next week. Thank you very much.